Harrison slammed the loan papers onto Cole's porch railing like he was driving a nail into a coffin. Full payment. $1,500. You've got 30 days. Cole didn't flinch, but Mara saw his hands go still at his sides. That particular stillness that meant he was holding himself together by pure will. You can't call that loan, it's not due for 2 years. Read the fine print. Harrison's smile was the kind that had nothing warm in it. Credit risk clause. And given that you're harboring a woman of questionable character on your property, his eyes slid to Mara like she was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. I think the bank's concern is entirely justified. If you've ever watched someone try to destroy a good person simply because they couldn't control them, if you've ever stood in the path of that kind of power and asked yourself what you would do, stay with me. Because this story is about exactly that moment. Like this video. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe now. Because this one goes all the way to the bone. The morning Mara Vance arrived in Iron Ridge, nobody saw her coming. That was the story of her life, really. Moving through places the way weather moves through, noticed only for the damage left behind, never for what was there before. She was 31 years old, and she had been walking since she was 16, not wandering, not drifting the way people romanticize about the road. Walking because standing still had stopped being an option a long time ago. She stepped off the supply wagon at the edge of town, and her boots hit the ground and the driver didn't even look back, just clicked his tongue at the horses and rolled on like she'd never been there at all. Iron Ridge looked like a place that had given up arguing with the sun. The buildings were gray and leaning. The saloon sign hung crooked on one chain, turning slowly in the hot wind. Even the dust seemed tired, settling over everything in a thick, indifferent layer. A few people moved along the boardwalk, but their eyes slid past Mara the way eyes slide past a fence post, registering her existence without granting it any weight. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and started walking. She'd been moving for 3 weeks, town to town, asking about work, any work, and being told the same thing in different voices. No work for women. Not hiring. Try somewhere else. She'd gotten good at reading the moment when a man's expression shifted from neutral to decided. That small tightening around the mouth, the slight drop of the eyes. It took about 4 seconds, usually, sometimes less. What she knew how to do was cook. Not just feed people, but actually cook. The kind of food that made people stop mid-bite and pay attention to what they were eating. She'd learned it out of necessity, working in boarding houses and cattle camps, and a hotel kitchen in Cheyenne that burned down in her 2nd month. She'd taken what she could carry and kept moving. Iron Ridge was supposed to be different. Someone in the last town, a tired woman at a water pump who'd had the look of someone who'd learned everything the hard way, had mentioned the Mercer spread. Ranch outside of town, short-handed, struggling, the kind of operation that couldn't afford to be particular. Mara was hoping that was true. She was also hoping she still had enough dignity left to ask for work without it feeling like begging. She passed the general store. 2 men sat on the bench out front with the particular stillness of men who had nothing to do and all day to do it. "Lost, ma'am?" The one on the left had a voice like gravel in a can. Mara stopped. She knew better than to keep walking. That just invited more from behind. "No." "You look lost." "I'm not. Ain't much here for a woman on her own." He said it the way people say things they've decided are facts, not opinions. "I'm looking for work." That got a laugh from both of them. The second man leaned back, crossing his arms. "Work? Doing what?" "Cooking." "Cooking." He said it like she'd claimed she was looking for work as a riverboat captain. "Lady, most folks here can barely afford to eat. You think someone's going to pay you to cook for 'em?" Mara didn't answer. She turned and walked. Behind her, she heard one of them say something low, and the other one laughed again, that particular laugh men use when they want you to know you've been dismissed. She didn't look back. The Mercer Ranch sat about 2 miles outside of town, tucked against a line of low hills that looked like they'd been baked into the earth itself. By the time Mara reached the gate, her throat was raw from the dust and her shoulders ached from the bag. But she stood straight. She'd learned that much. Whatever else was going wrong, you stood straight. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it had the same worn-down look as the town, like something that had once been impressive was now just trying to hold on. Fences sagged. A gate hung on one hinge. In the far pasture, she could see cattle moving slow and heavy in the heat, their ribs showing even from this distance. A man was working near the corral, hammering at a fence post with the focused intensity of someone doing one thing to avoid thinking about 5 others. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his shirt soaked through in the back and under the arms. He didn't look up when Mara approached the fence. "Excuse me." The hammering stopped. He straightened slowly, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, and turned around. And Mara got her first look at Cole Mercer. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s maybe, but his face carried years that had nothing to do with age. Deep lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a jaw that was set like he'd gotten into the habit of bracing for impact. His eyes were gray and direct and completely unimpressed. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has interrupted an already difficult day. "Help you?" "I'm looking for work." Mara kept her voice level. She'd had this conversation enough times to know that the first 30 seconds were everything. "Don't need any." "I heard you were short-handed." "Heard wrong." He turned back to the fence post, picked up the hammer. Mara didn't move. He drove 3 nails without looking at her. Then his shoulders tensed, just slightly, and he stopped. "Lady, I don't know who told you to come out here, but they wasted your time. I've got nothing for you." "I'm a cook," Mara said. "Don't need a cook." "Everyone needs a cook." Cole turned around then, and for the first time he really looked at her. Took his time about it, too. The kind of looking that was assessment, not rudeness. Or maybe it was both. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking for a job." "This isn't charity." "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking to work." Cole set the hammer down. He crossed his arms, and she could see the calluses on his hands, the scar along his left forearm from something she didn't ask about. "You ever worked a ranch before?" "No." "Lived this far out? Middle of nowhere, no town nearby, no help if something goes wrong?" "No." "Then you don't know what you're asking." He picked the hammer back up. "Go back to town. Find something easier." The heat rose in Mara's chest, not the temperature, the other kind. "I'm not looking for easy." "Could have fooled me." He said it flat, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. She stood there for another 10 seconds. He didn't turn around. Then Mara Vance did something she'd gotten very good at over 15 years of having doors closed in her face. She walked away. Not defeated. She was very clear in her own mind about the difference between walking away and giving up. She walked away from Cole Mercer and started thinking. She'd noticed the creek on the way in, quarter-mile east, hidden behind a stand of scrubby trees. She went there now, dropped her bag in the shade, and knelt down to wash the dust off her hands and face. The water was cool, and she stayed there a minute longer than she needed to, letting it run over her wrists. Then she opened her bag. She didn't have much. A small pot, a knife, some onions and carrots, and a few potatoes she'd bought in the last town. A cloth bag of dried beans, salt, a tin of lard. She found wild herbs growing near the water's edge. She knew what they were, had learned years ago to know what grew where and what was safe. She gathered a handful and set them with the rest. The fire she built was small and efficient. She'd learned to make fires that didn't announce themselves. The pot went over the flames, water from the creek, then the beans, then the vegetables cut rough and quick, then the salt and the herbs. Not fancy. Didn't need to be. What needed to happen was for the smell to travel. She let it simmer for the better part of an hour, stirring when it needed stirring, adding a little more water when the level dropped. The smell that came off that pot was something she was proud of. The kind of smell that bypassed the thinking part of a person and went straight somewhere older. When it was ready, she ladled a portion into her tin bowl, covered the pot, banked the fire. Then she carried the bowl back toward the ranch. Cole was closer to the barn now, crouched over a wagon wheel, doing the kind of work that required both hands and most of his attention. He didn't look up when she approached. Mara set the bowl down on a flat rock about 4 feet from where he was working. Then she stepped back. He looked at the bowl, then at her. "What's this?" Stew. I can see that. What's it doing here? It's for you. Cole's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of anger. I told you. I know what you told me. Mara kept her voice even. I'm not asking you to change your mind. I'm leaving this here. You can eat it or you can throw it out. That's up to you. She turned and started walking toward the road. Where are you going? Into town. On foot? Unless you've got a horse to lend me. Cole didn't answer. Mara kept walking. She didn't look back. By the time she reached Iron Ridge, the sun was halfway down the sky and her legs were beginning to protest in earnest. She found a spot behind the general store, out of the wind, out of sight, and sat with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and tried to think practically about what came next. She had no money for a room. She had the rest of the stew in the pot by the creek and enough supplies for maybe 2 more meals if she was careful. She was 31 years old, sitting in the dirt behind a building in a town where nobody knew her name, and the best prospect she'd managed to turn up all day was a man who'd told her twice she wasn't wanted. This was not, she reminded herself, the worst situation she'd ever been in. She'd figure it out. She always figured it out. The figuring out was exhausting, but it was the one skill she'd never lost. Cole Mercer stood in the middle of his kitchen staring at the bowl. He hadn't meant to bring it inside. He'd meant to leave it where she'd put it, let the heat take it, walk away. Instead, he'd picked it up without consciously deciding to and carried it into the house and set it on the table, and now he was standing there looking at it like it had said something to him. He should throw it out. He should have thrown it out 40 minutes ago. He sat down, picked up the spoon, took one bite mostly to satisfy himself that it was going to be bad, that he'd been right to dismiss her, that this whole thing was exactly as pointless as he'd told her it was. The taste stopped him cold. It wasn't just good. It was the kind of food that made you aware of your body in a way you usually weren't. Every bite was something, not fancy, nothing he couldn't have named the ingredients of, but put together in a way that was completely different from what he'd been eating for the last 2 years, which was food that kept him alive and nothing else. He ate the whole bowl without stopping, set the spoon down, sat very still. He thought about the way she'd stood there. No begging, no pleading, none of the softening that women were supposed to do when they wanted something from a man who didn't want to give it. She'd just stood there and stated her case, and when he'd refused, she'd left without a word and come back with a bowl of stew and put it down like a challenge and walked away. Judge the work, not me. She hadn't said it, but it had been in everything she did. Cole pushed back from the table and went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He was up before dawn and in the saddle before the sun crested the hills, riding toward Iron Ridge with a feeling in his chest he hadn't identified until he was already halfway there. It wasn't charity. He was clear on that. He didn't do charity, couldn't afford it in any sense of the word, and a woman who made stew that good from a handful of vegetables and creek water didn't need anyone's charity anyway. He found her behind the general store. She was sitting up the moment she heard the horse, instantly alert. No slow waking, no disorientation. Someone who'd learned to come awake fast. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt with quick automatic movements. "What are you doing here?" Cole looked at her for a long moment. She was tired, trying not to look it, but he knew what tired looked like. He'd been wearing it himself for years. "You got a place to stay?" "I'll manage." "That's not what I asked." A beat, then, "No." Cole nodded. He'd expected that. "All right, come on." "Come on where?" "Back to the ranch." He turned the horse. "You want the job or not?" There was a pause long enough that he almost looked back. Then, "You're hiring me." "That's what I just said." "Why?" Cole stopped the horse. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was not something he usually did with questions that had obvious answers. "Because that stew was the best thing I've eaten in 5 years," he said finally. "And if you can do that with next to nothing, I figure you can handle feeding my crew." He held out his hand. "You coming?" Mara looked at his hand. Then she grabbed it, and he pulled her up onto the horse, and they rode back to the ranch in silence. And Cole told himself that this was a practical decision. A business decision, the kind a reasonable man makes when presented with evidence. He told himself that for a while. The crew was gathered near the barn when they rode in. 5 men, all of them rough-edged, all of them looking at Mara with the same expression, somewhere between skeptical and hostile, with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name yet. Cole dismounted and helped her down. "This is Mara Vance," he said. "She's the new cook." The silence that followed had weight to it. The wiry one with the scar across his cheek, she'd learned his name was Tyler, was the first to react. He laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. "You serious, boss? Do I look like I'm joking?" "No offense, ma'am." Tyler's tone suggested the phrase was doing a lot of work there. "But you don't exactly look like ranch material." "She's not here to work the ranch," Cole said. "She's here to cook. That's it." The older one with gray in his beard, Davis, spat in the dirt. "We don't need a cook. I'll decide what we need." Cole's voice was calm in the way a still pond is calm. Nothing moving on the surface, but you couldn't see the bottom. "Get back to work." The men moved, grumbling, shuffling, their eyes following Mara as Cole walked her toward the house. The kitchen was small, functional. A wood-burning stove that had seen better days, a sink fed by a hand pump that complained when you used it, shelves that were about half empty. The pantry had flour, salt, dried beans, some cornmeal, a few tins of things she couldn't identify, a slab of salt pork that needed to be used soon. "It's not much," Cole said. Mara looked at the space, the light that came through the one window, the cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall that someone had kept well-seasoned despite everything else going to seed. "It'll do." Cole nodded. "Breakfast is at 6. You got a problem with that?" "No?" "Good." He turned to leave, then stopped. Just for a moment. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, without turning around. "Do what?" "Leave the stew, when you knew I wasn't going to hire you, when I'd already said no twice." Mara thought about it. The honest answer was simple enough. "Because I made it, and food that's made to be eaten shouldn't go to waste." She paused. "And because I wanted you to understand what you were turning down before you made your final decision." Cole stood there a second more. Then he walked out. Mara stood in her kitchen. She'd already started thinking of it that way, which she recognized was probably foolish, but she let herself do it anyway, and looked around at the space that was now hers to work with. She got started. The first breakfast was biscuits, gravy, scrambled eggs with some dried herbs. It was solid, competent food, the kind of thing she could make in her sleep at this point. The men ate in silence. Not grateful silence, just silence. When they were done, they pushed back from the table and left without a word between them, and Mara stood in the kitchen afterward washing dishes alone, her hands moving through the soapy water while she worked on keeping her expression neutral and her feelings somewhere below the surface where they couldn't be used against her. She'd expected resistance. She hadn't quite expected this, the particular cold of being looked through rather than at. "You can do this," she told herself, scrubbing at a plate that didn't need as much scrubbing as she was giving it. "You've done harder things." She wasn't entirely sure that was true. The days that followed were worse in the specific way that slow things are worse than sudden ones. No single moment she could point to and say, "That's what broke me." Just a steady accumulation of turned backs and dropped eyes and conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She brought food out to the men in the fields, and they took it without looking at her. She passed them in the yard, and they found reasons to be somewhere else. At night, she could hear them in the bunkhouse, their voices carrying across the quiet in an indistinct rumble. She didn't need to make out words. She knew what the sound of people talking about you in the dark felt like. She kept her head down, focused on the work. 3 meals a day, kitchen clean by 9, fires banked right, pantry organized so she always knew exactly what she had and how long it would last. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. But being good at something people don't want to acknowledge you for is a particular kind of lonely. On the 5th day, Tyler cornered her outside the kitchen. He was leaning against the wall when she came around the corner, and she knew immediately from the way he was standing that this wasn't accidental. He'd been waiting. "You know you don't belong here, right?" He said it conversationally, like he was commenting on the weather. Mara looked at him. He had the scar, close up, running from just below his left eye to the corner of his mouth. She wondered sometimes about the stories behind scars. Not this time. "I'm doing my job." "Your job?" He shook his head slowly. Lady, you're not doing anything we couldn't do ourselves. Then why aren't you? Something shifted in his face, a flicker of something sharp and sudden. Watch your mouth. Or what? He stepped closer. Mara felt her heart rate change. Not fear exactly, but that older thing underneath fear that makes you very aware of the space between yourself and another person. She didn't step back. You think you're tough? Tyler's voice had dropped. You think you can make it out here? I'm still here, aren't I? He stared at her for a long moment, then his lip curled. Not for long. He walked away and Mara stood there with her hands clenched at her sides until she heard his boots hit the far side of the yard, and then she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That night Cole found her on the porch. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her sitting there, and for a moment she thought he was going to keep walking. Instead, he sat down beside her. You all right? Fine. You don't look fine. She almost said fine again. They're giving you trouble. He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer. Nothing I can't handle. That's not what I asked. Mara turned to look at him. In the dark, with the lamp off, she couldn't see his expression well, just the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. Why do you care? Because I brought you here. He said it matter-of-factly, no particular weight to it. That makes it my responsibility. I don't need you to protect me. I'm not trying to protect you. I'm asking if you're all right. The honesty of that, the distinction he was drawing, caught her off guard. She looked away. I'm fine. Cole sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up. If that changes, he said, let me know. He walked back inside and left her there, and Mara sat in the dark for a long time after that, listening to the sounds the land made at night and trying to figure out why his straightforwardness was harder to sit with than Tyler's hostility. Hostility she knew how to handle. The heat came 3 weeks later, and it came like something that had been planning its arrival for months. Mara woke before dawn and knew immediately that something was wrong. The air was too still, too thick. She stood on the porch and watched the sky go from black to gray to a pale, bleached blue that felt threatening in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't been watching weather her whole life. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed past anything she'd felt before. Not uncomfortable heat, punishing heat. The kind that makes every action cost more than it should. Cole was out with the men from first light, all of them working through it without complaint because complaint wouldn't cool the air. Mara brought water out to them every hour, walking the fields with a heavy bucket and a ladle. And they took what she offered and went back to work. And she went back to the kitchen, and the kitchen was even hotter than outside, but it didn't matter because the work was the work. How long is this supposed to last? She asked Cole, handing him the ladle. Long as it wants to. He drank and handed it back. Weather doesn't ask permission. The cattle? His jaw was already tight. It got tighter. Nothing we can do but keep them watered and hope. He walked away before she could say anything else, and Mara stood there holding the empty ladle, watching him go, and felt the first real flutter of dread about what was coming. The first cow died on the 4th day of the heat. She heard it, the commotion, the raised voices, the running boots. She went outside and found the men gathered in the south pasture around a young heifer lying on its side. Even from a distance, she could tell the animal was gone. The way it was lying, the stillness of it. Cole was crouching beside it when she got close. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he stood up. We lose any more, Davis? Not yet, but they're struggling. Davis was sweating through his shirt, his face drawn tight. Water's running low in the creek. I know. Cole turned and walked back toward the barn, and the men stood there a moment before starting the grim work of dragging the carcass away. Mara followed Cole. He was moving fast, jaw set, not looking back. Cole. He didn't stop. Cole. He spun around. What? She stopped a few feet away. The anger in his eyes wasn't directed at her, but it was close enough to her that she felt it. Is there anything I can do? You're doing it. Keep the men fed. That's all I need. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She hesitated, said it anyway. I want to help. Cole looked at her. Something moved through his face. Exhaustion, frustration, maybe both together. You want to help? Stay out of the way. He turned and walked into the barn. Mara stood in the full sun, the heat pressing down on her shoulders, and told herself that being angry at him right now was a luxury she couldn't afford. He was afraid. Not of the work. Of losing something he'd spent years building. Fear that looked like anger was the most common kind she'd ever seen. She went back to the kitchen, made supper with what she had, kept them fed. By the end of the first week, 2 more cattle were dead. The pantry was thinning faster than Mara had calculated because the heat made men hungrier and thirstier in equal measure, and what looked like a reasonable supply started looking different when you were feeding people who were burning themselves up every hour of the day. She started rationing carefully. Quietly, so the men wouldn't notice at first. Smaller portions, stretched further, nothing wasted. She'd gotten good at this particular art over the years, the math of making not enough feel like enough, at least for today. Tyler noticed on the 8th night. This is it? He stared at his plate like it had offended him. This is all we get? It's what we have, Mara said from the stove, keeping her back to him. It's not enough. Then don't eat it. She heard the fork slam down, the scrape of his chair. You think this is funny? She turned around. No, I think we're all in the same situation, and complaining about it won't change anything. Tyler stood up. He was a compact man, but he used his size intentionally, the way some men learn to. You know what I think? I think you're the problem. Ever since you got here, everything's gone to hell. Sit down, Tyler. That was Davis, from across the table, his voice even and tired. No, I'm tired of sitting down and shutting up. Tyler pointed at Mara, and his hand was shaking slightly. Not anger, she realized. Hunger and fear underneath the hunger. She shows up, the boss hires her for no reason, and now we're starving. You telling me that's a coincidence? It's the heat, Davis said. Not her. You sure about that? The room went quiet. The other men looked at their plates or the wall or each other, anywhere except at Mara, which told her plenty. If you have a problem with me, Mara said, say it. Tyler laughed. Just did. Then what do you want me to do about it? I want you to leave. 2 words, and they landed like 2 fists. Mara felt her chest tighten around them. She stood there and held them and tried to find the words to answer back, and in the silence while she was searching, the door opened. Cole came in. He was covered in dust and sweat, his eyes moving over the room in one practiced sweep. What's going on? Nothing, Tyler said quickly. Cole looked at Mara, then back at Tyler. Didn't sound like nothing. Just talking. About what? The silence stretched. Tyler's jaw worked. About how we're running out of food. We all know that. Some of us think it might be time to make some changes. Tyler's eyes went to Mara and then away again. Maybe we don't need a cook right now. Maybe that money could go somewhere else. Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that Mara thought he might be considering it, and the thought sat in her stomach like a stone. She stays, Cole said. Boss, she stays. End of discussion. Tyler's jaw tightened. Something moved in his eyes. Not just anger, she thought. Something that went deeper than this room, deeper than the heat and the dying cattle and the shrinking food supply. Something that had been building for a long time before she arrived. He grabbed his plate and walked out. The other men followed in 1s and 2s, and then it was just Mara and Cole in the kitchen. She didn't look at him. Her hands were shaking, and she didn't want him to see that. You all right? He asked. Fine. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. A silence, then, don't let Tyler get to you. He's angry. We all are. But that's not your fault. Mara looked up at him. Then why does it feel like it is? Cole didn't have an answer for that, which was its own kind of answer. The heat stretched on. The ranch contracted around it, each day tighter than the last. More cattle died. The creek dropped to a trickle. The pantry shelves started showing bare wood. Mara stood in the pantry early one morning, the door half open, looking at what they had left. A little flour, handful of dried beans. The salt pork was gone. There were some tins, but she'd been counting on them, and they weren't going to last. She did the math 3 times, hoping she'd gotten it wrong. She hadn't. She closed the pantry door and went outside. She walked along the creek bed, moving slow, watching the banks. The plants that grew near water even when the water was low. She knew what she was looking for. She'd foraged before, plenty of times, in plenty of places. Dandelion greens, wild onions, and further downstream, in a section where the mud was still damp, the thick stalks of cattails. She filled her basket. It took hours in the heat, moving slowly, taking what was there without stripping anything bare. By the time she started back, her arms were aching and her throat was dry, and she felt, underneath the exhaustion, a kind of fierce satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of her. That night she made stew from what she'd gathered and what little they had left. The men stared at their bowls. "What is this?" Tyler asked. "Stew. Doesn't look like stew. It's what we have." "What's in it?" "Beans. Vegetables." "What kind of vegetables?" Mara set down the pot she was holding. "Dandelion greens, wild onions, cattail roots, things that grow around here. Things you can eat." She met his eyes. "If you don't want it, don't eat it." Tyler pushed the bowl away. The other men exchanged glances. Then Davis picked up his spoon and took a bite, chewed slowly, nodded. Another man tried it, then another. "It's not bad," Davis said. "Better than nothing," someone agreed. The room eased, incrementally. Mara turned back to the stove and let herself breathe. She started going out every morning after that. Further each time, ranging out from the ranch in widening arcs, learning the land the way she learned every kitchen she'd ever worked in. Methodically, without assumptions, taking note of what was where and when it would be gone. She found wild berries on a hillside east of the creek. She found rabbit tracks near an outcrop of rocks, and spent an afternoon making snares from twisted grass and thin branches, the way an old woman in Wyoming had shown her when she was 22 and desperate, and the world had seemed specifically designed to close every door. The first 2 snares came up empty. The third had a rabbit. Small, but real. That night she made rabbit stew, and the men ate in silence, and even Tyler ate, and nobody said anything about it. Afterward, Cole found her at the well, washing out the pot. "Where'd you get the rabbit?" "Caught it." A pause. "You set snares?" "Yeah." "Where'd you learn that?" "Here and there." She kept working, not looking up. "I've had to figure things out as I went along, mostly." Cole was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there in the way you feel a presence that has weight to it. "You're doing good work, Mara," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her directly, the way he'd looked at her that first day in the yard. Assessing, honest, not bothering with softening, but the thing behind his eyes was different now. "You think so?" she said. "I know so." She looked back down at the pot. Her hands had gone still in the water. "Thanks," she managed. He nodded and walked away, and Mara stood there with her hands submerged and let herself feel, just for a moment, how much those 2 words had cost her to say and how much his 2 words had given back. Then the well started running dry. She noticed it first, but the bucket coming up lighter, the sound of it hitting bottom too soon. She lowered it again and got the same. Her stomach dropped. She told Cole immediately. He checked it himself, standing over the dark hole with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the controlled frustration she'd gotten used to. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like giving up. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Few days, maybe less." "What do we do?" "There's another well, north end of the property. Hasn't been used in years." He straightened up, and she could see him pulling himself back from whatever edge he'd been standing at. "I'll take a couple men up tomorrow, see if we can get it working." "And if you can't?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, lying in her room staring at the ceiling, Mara made herself think through every option she could imagine. She made herself not flinch from the worst of them. This was something she'd gotten good at over the years. Looking at bad situations without blinking, because blinking didn't help and sometimes scared you so badly you couldn't act. And then, somewhere between the thinking and the fear, she landed on an idea. She got up before dawn and packed a bag. Took every container she could carry. Canteens, tins, the 2 clay jugs she'd found in the back of the pantry. filled what she could from the well before it gave up entirely. Then she walked north along the creek bed, past where she'd been before, past where the land started to turn rough and rocky. It took 2 hours. The sun was already brutal by the time she found it, a small pool tucked behind a cluster of boulders, fed by some underground source that the drought hadn't reached yet. The water was low, but it was there, clear and cool when she cupped her hand into it. She filled everything she'd brought. It was a lot to carry back. She carried it anyway. When she walked back into the ranch yard, Cole was standing at the well, watching her come. She could see by the look on his face that he'd been out there a while. "Where did you go?" he asked. "Found a pool, upstream, past the rocks." "How far?" "A few miles." He stared at her. "You walked that far on your own, in this heat." "We needed water." "Mara." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. "That's dangerous. So is dying of thirst." She set down the containers. Her arms were shaking slightly from the weight, and she turned so he couldn't see. "The pool's small. Enough for a few days if we're careful." Cole came over and picked up the heaviest jug, and when she looked at him, she saw it. Right there in his face, the thing he almost never let show. He was scared. Not for himself. For her. "Next time you go," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm coming with you. You're needed here. So are you." He looked at her steadily. "Next time. That's not a request." There was something in the air between them then that neither of them had a name for yet, something that had been accumulating like water in a low place, filling up so slowly you didn't notice until it was already there. "Fine," Mara said. "Next time." He reached out and touched her shoulder, just once, just briefly, a hand that rested there for 1 second and then lifted. "Thank you." He walked away. Mara stood in the yard with her hand going automatically to the spot where his had been, feeling the warmth that remained through the fabric. She stood there until the warmth faded, and then she went back to the kitchen because there was always work to do, and doing the work was how she kept herself from thinking about things she wasn't ready to think about yet. The heat wasn't done with them, not even close. But for the first time since she'd walked through that gate, Mara Vance felt like she was standing on ground that was hers to stand on, not given to her, not allowed, claimed, inch by inch, meal by meal, mile by mile, through the only currency she'd ever had that nobody could take away from her. The work, always the work, and underneath the work, something quieter and more dangerous than anything Tyler had said to her, something that had nothing to do with drought or cattle or a half-empty pantry. The slow, terrifying, completely involuntary realization that she had stopped thinking about leaving. The days had a sameness to them now that was both a mercy and a kind of slow erosion. Mara woke before the sun, every morning, without needing to decide to. Her body had learned the rhythm of the ranch the way it had learned every place she'd ever stayed long enough to matter. Not comfort, exactly, but a kind of calibration. She knew which floorboards in the kitchen would creak and which wouldn't. She knew that the stove drafted better when the wind came from the northwest. She knew that Davis took his coffee black and too hot to drink comfortably, and that the younger hand named Pete would eat anything you put in front of him without complaint, but would leave every meal slightly hungry because he was too proud to ask for more. She knew these things because she'd been paying attention, and paying attention was the one thing she'd never been able to stop doing. Cole had gone north with Davis and Pete 2 days after the well started failing. They were trying to get the old well working again. They'd been gone overnight, and the morning they were supposed to return, Mara woke up, and the air had that stillness to it again. Not the bad kind this time, just the ordinary early stillness before the heat began its daily assault. She made biscuits with the last of the decent flour, stretched them small, 16 instead of 12, so there'd be enough for whenever they got back. She was pulling them off the iron when she heard the horses. She didn't go outside. She wasn't sure what kind of news was coming, and she'd learned that you didn't run toward information you might need a moment to prepare for. Instead, she stayed at the stove, and she listened to the sounds from the yard. Horses, men's voices, the particular cadence of people who were tired and not trying to hide it. Cole came through the kitchen door. One look at his face was enough. "It's dry," Mara said. "Yeah." She set the pan down. "Completely?" "Completely." He dropped into a chair at the table with the heaviness of a man whose legs had been deciding to do that for a while. His hat was in his hand, and he turned it once, twice, then set it on the table. 200 feet down and nothing but dirt. Mara didn't say anything for a moment. She poured coffee, the last of what they had, she was already calculating, and set it in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking. "What do we do?" she asked. "Same thing we've been doing. Ration what we have, make it last as long as possible, and hope the heat breaks before we run out." He finally drank. His eyes were red at the edges from the dust and the glare. "And if it doesn't—" He stopped. "Then we figure out something else." Cole looked at her. "There isn't something else, Mara. That's the part I can't get around. We're not talking about inconvenience. We're talking about losing the herd. Losing the herd means losing the income. Losing the income means losing the—" He stopped again and looked at the cup in his hands. "The ranch," she finished. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. That night Mara lay awake for a long time. Not the restless kind of awake, the working kind. She lay flat on her back in the dark and thought through everything she knew about the land around them, the creek bed, the direction it ran, the kinds of plants that grew at the edges of it, and what that said about what was underground. The pool she'd already found once. She got up at 3 in the morning when the night was at its quietest. She packed every container she had, both clay jugs, the 3 canteens, 2 tin pails. She put on her heaviest boots and tied her hair back and left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Only went upstream, back before noon." And then she walked out into the dark before she could think too carefully about whether this was a reasonable thing to do. The night was cooler than the days by about 30 degrees, which still wasn't cool, but it was livable. She could walk in it without the sun trying to cook her from the outside in. She followed the creek bed north, using the stars the way she'd learned to, moving steadily. She went past where she'd found the pool before. Further. The land climbed slightly as she moved, and the rocks got larger and the vegetation changed. Sparse, yes, but different. The kind of different that might mean something. She almost missed it. It was the smell that stopped her. Not water exactly, but the absence of the dry dust smell, a subtle dampness that didn't match the air around it. She turned toward it and picked her way through a cluster of boulders, and there, in a shallow depression she'd have walked right past in daylight, was a seep. Not a pool, just a place where water was working its way up through the rock, slow and steady, collecting in the lowest point. It wasn't much. Maybe 6 inches deep, 3 feet across. But it was there, and it was clean, and it wasn't going to dry up the same way the pool had because it was fed from somewhere underneath. Mara sat down beside it on the rock and put her hands in it and felt the cold of it move up through her palms and into her arms. She sat like that for a minute, maybe longer. Then she started filling containers. She got back to the ranch with the sun still low, her arms aching badly and both shoulders sending specific complaints with every step. She set the containers down in the kitchen and pumped what little was left in the well into a separate bucket. She had enough to cook with for 2 days, maybe 3 if she was careful. Cole was in the yard when she came back out. He'd been up for a while. She could tell by the way he'd already been working, the set of his shoulders when he turned and saw her coming from the direction of the creek. "You went again," he said. "We needed water." "Mara," his voice was tight. "I told you it wasn't safe to go alone." "You were asleep." "I told you to wake me." "You needed the sleep more than you needed to walk 3 miles in the dark." She met his eyes steadily. "I found something. A seep up past the pool. Fed from underground, I think. It's not going to be enough for the cattle, but it'll keep us in water for cooking and drinking while we figure out the rest." Cole looked at her for a long time. She could see the argument he wanted to have, the one about safety, about reasonable behavior, about not going off alone in the dark into rough country. She could also see the moment he did the math and understood what she'd brought back. "Show me where," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, early, before the heat." He nodded. Then, almost reluctantly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have cattle dying." "I know. He looked out at the pasture and his jaw did the thing it did when he was working very hard to keep his face neutral. 2 more last night. Mara felt the weight of that settle over both of them. How many left? 31, down from 47 when the heat started. He said the numbers like they were inventory, like facts, but she'd gotten good enough at reading him to see what was underneath the flatness. Every one of those animals was money he'd already spent, debt he'd already taken on, future he'd already committed to. We can survive losing more if the heat breaks soon. If it doesn't, he stopped. I don't know if we can survive not. They stood in the early morning sun, both of them looking at a pasture full of cattle that were thin and miserable and trying their best to endure, and neither of them had anything useful to say about it, so they didn't say anything. Sometimes that was the most honest thing. The tension in the bunkhouse was getting worse. Mara could feel it the way you feel weather coming, a pressure change, small behavioral shifts, men who were already stretched thin starting to fray at the edges. They were hungry. Not starving, not yet, but hungry in the grinding, demoralizing way that wears a person down over weeks rather than days. And hungry men who are also exhausted and scared tend to need somewhere to put it. Mara was where they put it. She'd accepted that mostly. She'd understood from the first week that her presence here was going to be a target for whatever else was going wrong, because that was how it worked when you were the newest and the most different, and the one everyone had opinions about. She could live with the silence and the dropped eyes. She could manage Tyler's particular brand of low-grade hostility. What she wasn't ready for was the night it went somewhere else entirely. It was almost 2 weeks into the heat. She was in the kitchen cleaning up after supper, the men already gone to the bunkhouse, and she was almost at the end of her energy for the day, the kind of tired that gets into your hands and makes simple tasks slow and clumsy. She was washing the last pot when she heard footsteps on the porch, not Cole's stride. She knew Cole's stride by now. These were lighter, quicker, with a particular rhythm she recognized. Tyler came through the kitchen door without knocking, which wasn't unusual, but the way he stood once he was inside was. He was blocking the doorway. She didn't think he'd done it on purpose. She didn't think he'd thought about it at all, which was in some ways worse. You think you're smart, don't you? Not a question. I think I'm doing my job, Mara said without turning from the sink. Your job. He made the word into something unpleasant. Right, the cooking, the gathering, the going out and finding water and making yourself look like you're saving everyone. A pause. You know what I see? I see a woman who's very good at making the boss think he needs her. Mara turned around. She dried her hands on her apron slowly, deliberately, keeping her eyes on him. I don't care what the boss thinks. I care about keeping people fed. Sure you do. What do you want from me, Tyler? Honestly. I want you gone. He said it plainly. I want you to pack up your stuff and get back on whatever wagon brought you here and go find somewhere else to be somebody's charity case, because you're not wanted here. You were never wanted here. You just won't take the hint. The words sat between them. Mara felt their weight, not as a shock because she'd known something like this was coming, but as a tiredness, a deep, specific tiredness at the amount of energy it took to stand in rooms where you weren't wanted and keep standing. You're scared, she said. Tyler's face changed. What? You're scared. The ranch might fail. The cattle are dying. You're running out of food and water, and you don't know how to fix any of it, and neither does Cole, and neither do I. And that's terrifying. She kept her voice even. So you pick me, because I'm easiest. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind she'd experienced yet. Not the silence before someone speaks, but the silence before someone decides. Get out, Tyler said, his voice low and different from before. This is my kitchen. I said get... What's going on in here? Cole's voice from the doorway. They both turned. He'd come in from the yard side, through the back, and he was standing there with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that Mara had not seen before. Tyler straightened. Nothing, boss. Just talking. Didn't look like nothing. Cole's eyes moved to Mara. She gave the smallest shake of her head. She didn't need him to fight this. Cole looked back at Tyler. Get to bed. Tyler opened his mouth. Now, Cole said. Still quiet. still without raising his voice. That particular quality of stillness that Mara had learned meant the thing underneath was very loud indeed. Tyler went. Cole stayed in the doorway after he was gone. He looked at Mara, and for once she didn't have the energy to manage her expression, so he got to see some of what she was actually feeling. "You should have come and got me," he said. "I didn't need rescuing." "I know you didn't." He came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel and dried the pot she'd been washing, which was such an unexpected thing for him to do that she almost didn't process it for a moment. "That's not what I mean. I mean, you shouldn't have to deal with that alone. I've been dealing with worse alone for most of my life." "That doesn't mean you should have to keep doing it." Mara looked at him. He was drying a pot with complete sincerity, this man who ran a failing cattle ranch and had about 17 things that needed his attention at any given moment, and he'd come in from the yard and found her in a bad situation, and his first instinct had been to help. Not to fix it for her, to help. She didn't know what to do with that. So she took the pot back and put it on the shelf and said, "Thank you. Good night." Cole set the dish towel down. "Good night, Mara." He left, and she stood in the kitchen for a few minutes after he was gone, doing nothing in particular, just standing there. Tyler was gone 3 mornings later. No announcement, no confrontation, just an empty spot at the breakfast table and an empty bunk and his horse missing from the corral. Davis said he'd heard hoofbeats in the night around 2 in the morning, but hadn't thought much of it. "Good riddance," Pete said, reaching for a biscuit. Davis shot him a look. "Mind yourself." "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "Everyone's thinking how we're already short-handed and now we're shorter." Davis looked at Cole, who was eating without expression, his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. "You knew he was going." "Figured it was coming," Cole said. "Couldn't stop it." "You try?" "What would have been the point? Man wants to leave, he leaves." Cole pushed back his plate. "We'll manage." Mara said nothing. She collected plates and went back to the stove. She was aware that Tyler leaving meant one fewer hostile presence in her daily life, and she was also aware that it meant the ranch was down another hand, and Cole's face had gotten a little grayer and a little more tired. Those two things didn't cancel each other out. They just sat side by side. The relief lasted 4 days. She was checking the snares at dusk on the 4th day. She'd set 3 of them along the creek bed, far enough from the ranch to be worth checking, but close enough that she could do it in the hour before dark. The light was going fast, the sky purpling in the west, and she was crouched down by the 2nd snare when she heard it. Footsteps. Not animal, not Davis or Pete, whose heavy boots she knew by sound by now. These were different, deliberate, coming from behind the cluster of rocks to her east. She stood up slowly. Her heart was already doing something faster than its usual pace. "Who's there?" Silence. "I hear you. Show yourself." More silence. And then Tyler stepped out from behind the largest rock, and Mara's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He looked bad. 3 days of not sleeping and not eating well, and probably not being clean, had taken something out of him. His eyes were too bright, his jaw was unshaven, and his clothes were dirty, and he had the look of a man who'd been out in the heat too long and hadn't come back quite right. "What are you doing here, Marcy?" Mara said. "Came back for what's mine." "You took your gear, your horse, your wages were paid." She kept her voice steady. Her eyes were moving over the rocks around him, calculating. "There's nothing here that's yours." "That's where you're wrong." He smiled, and it was the worst smile she'd seen on him yet. There was nothing behind it. "You cost me my job, my home. You made the boss choose between his own men and some woman who wandered in off the road. I figure that means you owe me something." "I didn't make Cole do anything." "You didn't have to. You just had to be here. Being here was enough." He took a step forward. "I've got nothing now. You understand that? Nowhere to go, no money, no—" His voice cracked slightly, and he caught it and shoved it back down. "And it's because of you." Mara looked around her for something useful. There was a branch on the ground about 6 feet to her left, thick and long enough to matter. She shifted slightly, casually in that direction. "Tyler, whatever you're thinking right now, it's not going to help you." "Maybe not." He took another step. "But it'll make me feel better." She moved for the branch. She got it, felt the solid weight of it in her hands and turned, and Tyler was already closer than she'd calculated. He grabbed it mid-swing, faster than she'd expected, and yanked it out of her hands like it was nothing, and his other hand caught her arm and held on. The grip was hard enough to make her breath go out. "You cost me everything," he said, his face close to hers. His voice had gone quiet and flat, which was worse than the yelling. Everything. The impact, when it came from the side. Cole hit Tyler like something with physics behind it. Shoulder, momentum, full weight. And both men went down hard. Mara stumbled back, catching herself on the rock, and watched them grapple in the dirt. Tyler was desperate, which made him dangerous. Cole was controlled, which made him more dangerous. It ended quickly. Cole got Tyler pinned against the ground, one forearm across his chest, his face inches from Tyler's. Both of them were breathing hard. "It's over," Cole said. Tyler's face was bleeding from somewhere, a cut above his eye. He stared up at Cole with hatred that had curdled into something beyond anger, something close to grief. "She's going to destroy you. You're too blind to see it. She'll take everything and you'll let her because you can't see past. The only person who's destroyed anything tonight is you." Cole's voice was flat. "You come near this ranch again. You come near her again." He stopped, and the pause itself was a kind of sentence. "You understand me?" Tyler looked at him. Something happened in his eyes. Not surrender exactly, but the moment before it. The moment when a person realizes they've already lost and the fighting is just costing them more. He nodded. Cole let him up. Tyler got to his feet slowly, touching the cut on his face, looking at the blood on his fingers. He looked at Mara once, and the expression he wore was something she'd carry with her for a long time. Not because it was threatening, but because underneath all of it, the hatred and the desperation and the exhaustion, there was something that looked like a man who hadn't meant to end up here, who'd started from somewhere different and arrived at this place without entirely meaning to. Then he turned and walked into the dark, and the sound of his footsteps faded, and he was gone. Cole stood up. His knuckles were scraped and he was breathing through his nose and his jaw was set hard. He turned to Mara. "You hurt?" Her arm where Tyler had grabbed it was throbbing in a specific way that she knew was going to be purple by morning. "No." "Mara." "I'm all right." She looked at his hands. "You?" He didn't answer that. He just stood there for a moment, and she could see him working through something. The aftermath of it, the adrenaline that had nowhere to go anymore. "He's not going to come back," Cole said finally. "He knows." He bent and picked up the branch she'd dropped and threw it off to the side like he needed to do something with his hands. "Come on, let's go." They walked back to the ranch without speaking. The night sounds had come back in around them. Crickets, something calling in the distance. The particular texture of quiet that this land made when nothing was actively going wrong. Mara's arm hurt. Her heart was still moving fast, but she wasn't shaking, which surprised her. She'd been expecting to be shaking. At the porch, Cole stopped and turned to face her, and in the light coming through the kitchen window, she could see the concern in his face, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. "You shouldn't go out there alone anymore," he said. "You've said that before." "And I meant it before. I mean it more now." He wasn't angry exactly. There was something that looked like fear underneath the firmness, and she'd learned by now to recognize that fear in him. Not for himself, never for himself, but for other people. For the ranch, for the things he'd decided were his to protect. "Tyler's gone, but that doesn't mean... I don't know who else he might have talked to in town. I don't know what he said or who was listening." Mara thought about that. She thought about the town, about the way people's eyes had moved over her since she'd arrived. "All right," she said. "I won't go alone." "Good." Cole looked at her for a long moment. The concern was still there, but something else had joined it. Something she didn't have a clean name for. "Thank you," he said. "For staying. For all of it." "You already thanked me." "I know, I'm doing it again." Mara almost smiled. "You're welcome, again." She turned toward the door. "You should put something on those knuckles." She went inside before he could respond, and she stood in the dark kitchen for a minute, her hand pressed to her arm where it still hurt, listening to the sound of him on the porch, for a moment longer before his footsteps moved away. The cattle count dropped to 26, then 24. Cole stopped announcing the numbers at meals, and Mara stopped asking because the asking had started to feel like measuring something that was only going to get worse. The supplies situation had stabilized, barely, provisionally, through a combination of foraging and the snares and the careful management of what little they had. It wasn't good food, it wasn't even adequate food, not really, but it was food, and the men were still on their feet, and that had to count for something. What Mara hadn't calculated for was the town. It started small. Davis rode in for supplies and came back with less than he'd asked for, and a look on his face that said something had happened that he wasn't sure how to explain. He set the parcels on the kitchen table and stood there. "Henderson's son at the store," he said. "Gave me what I paid for, but said his father's orders were they couldn't extend any more credit to the Mercer Ranch, said it wasn't personal." Mara looked at the parcels. "How much of what we needed did you get?" "About half." She didn't say what she was thinking. "All right, we'll make it stretch." The next week, Cole rode in himself and came back with even less. His face a particular kind of controlled that she'd learned meant something bad had happened that he was deciding how to tell her. He told her that night. They were on the porch. They'd taken to sitting out there in the evenings, she and Cole, while Davis and Pete played cards in the bunkhouse. It wasn't planned. It just happened. "Harrison was at the store when I went in," Cole said. He was looking at the dark line of the hills. "He's put the word out, town council backing him. Nobody sells to me. Nobody does business with me." A beat. "Nobody does business with anyone associated with me." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. "This is because of me," Mara said. "This is because Harrison is a greedy man who's been looking for an excuse and now he thinks he's found one." Cole's voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. Not anger. Or not only anger. "He's wanted this land for years. My father wouldn't sell. I won't sell. So he's going to squeeze me until I can't hold on anymore. By using me as the reason? By using whatever he can find as the reason." Cole looked at her. "That's how men like Harrison work. They don't fight you directly. They find the thing that matters to you and they threaten it." Mara understood that. She'd seen it before in other forms. Different scale, same logic. "What are you going to do?" "Same thing I always do." He turned back to the hills. "Work. Hold on. Wait." He paused. "And hope." 3 days later, 3 of the hands quit. Not Davis, not Pete. The other 3, men Mara had known by name and not much more. Quiet workers who had kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves through all of it. They came to Cole after breakfast, hats in hand, apologizing to the floor. Mara heard from the kitchen. She didn't go out. But she stood at the window and she watched Cole listen to them with his arms folded and his face still. And she watched him nod and pull money from his pocket and count it out and shake each of their hands. He didn't argue. He didn't try to change their minds. When they were gone, she found him in the barn. "They're not bad men," he said, without turning around. He was standing at a horse stall with his hands on the railing, his back to her. "Their families are in town. Harrison made it very clear what would happen if they kept working here." "I know. That leaves me, Davis, Pete." He was quiet for a moment. "And you?" "That's 4 people. Running a ranch that needs at least 8. He turned around and his face had a tiredness in it she hadn't seen before. Not physical tiredness, the other kind. "I keep doing the math, Mara. I can't make it come out right." She wanted to say something that would help. She was very good, usually, at finding the practical next step. The action that moved you forward even when the situation was bad. But standing in that barn in the particular quiet of a place that was running out of everything, she couldn't find it. "Then we do it with 4, she said. It wasn't inspiring, it wasn't even confident. But it was true. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the direction of one. "Yeah," he said. "We do it with 4. The hardest part wasn't the work. Mara could work. She'd always been able to work. The hardest part was the particular brand of isolation that settled over the ranch in the weeks that followed. Not loneliness exactly, but a kind of siege quality to daily life. The town that had never welcomed her was now actively closed to her, and she could feel the walls of it even out here, 2 miles from the nearest building. She kept cooking, kept foraging. kept going out to the seep with Cole. He'd made good on his word, came with her every time, carrying the heavier containers, and not saying much, just being there, a solid presence at her side in the dark morning walks. They talked sometimes on those walks. Not about the ranch, not about the supplies or the cattle or Harrison, about other things. She'd told him about Pennsylvania once, just briefly, and he'd listened without comment and without the pity that people usually brought to the subject of her leaving home at 16. He'd asked one question. Was it your choice? And when she said yes, he'd nodded and not asked anything else, which was exactly right. He'd told her about his parents another time. His father had built the ranch from nothing over 20 years. His mother had died when Cole was 12, and his father had gone on working the same way, every day. And Cole had learned that the working itself was the thing that kept you upright when everything else was trying to knock you down. His father had died 7 years ago, left him everything, debts and land and cattle and the specific weight of being the last one who remembered what this place was supposed to be. Was it worth it? Mara asked. Still finding out, Cole said. She understood that answer completely. It was on one of these mornings, walking back from the seep with full containers and the sun just beginning to make the sky go gold, that Cole stopped suddenly. What? Mara said. He was looking at the ground, a set of marks in the dry dirt, not their footprints, which she could identify by now from the pattern and the size. Something else. Boot prints, large, coming from the direction of the south pasture. Cole crouched down. His expression changed. How long ago? Mara asked. Last night, after we were in bed. He stood up and looked toward the south pasture, and his jaw was doing the thing it did. Come on. They went together quickly, and what they found stopped them both at the fence line. The wire had been cut. 3 places, cleanly, deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing. And in the south pasture, where 24 cattle had been grazing the night before, there were 19. 5 head. Gone. Cole stood at the fence for a long time without speaking. Mara stood beside him and didn't try to fill the silence. Tyler, she said finally. Tyler, he confirmed. He turned and walked back toward the ranch house, and his strides had something in them that was different from the usual, a purpose that was colder and more specific than she was used to seeing in him. He went to the house and came out with his rifle and checked it without looking up. I'm coming with you, Mara said. No. Cole, you can't go alone. I'll take Davis. Davis's knee is bad. You know that. She stepped in front of him. You need someone who can move fast if you have to. You need someone who knows this land. She held his eyes. You need me. Cole looked at her. The argument was in his face, the instinct to refuse, to protect, to keep her out of something dangerous. But underneath the argument was the thing he'd been learning about her for weeks now. That she was right, that she was capable, that refusing her was more about his own fear than her actual ability. You do exactly what I say, he said, finally. No arguments, no doing things on your own. Deal. I mean it, Mara. So do I. They left within the hour, tracking. Tyler hadn't bothered to hide the trail, which told its own story about the state he was in. The tracks led north and east, into rougher country, and Cole read the signs without stopping. Bent grass, a disturbed stone, marks in dry creek silt. He moved fast and she kept up with him, and they didn't talk much because moving and talking required the same energy, and moving was more important. They found the cattle in the early afternoon. A makeshift corral of rope and branches near a dried riverbed, the animals huddled together and miserable and obviously thirsty. The tracks around it were recent. Cole put a hand on Mara's arm. He didn't have to say it. She stopped moving. The shot came from the rocks to the north, and the dirt kicked up a foot from Cole's left boot. He grabbed Mara's arm, and they went behind a boulder together, his body between her and the direction the shot had come from. Tyler! Cole's voice was hard and flat. This ends now. Tyler's voice came back from somewhere in the rocks, bouncing off stone so it was hard to locate. Go home, boss. I'm just taking what I'm owed. Those cattle aren't yours. Maybe not yet, but they're the price of what you did to me. what she did to me. Another shot, close. Mara felt the air move near her face. Cole looked at her with an expression she recognized as the kind that comes right before a decision has been made. Stay here. Cole, but he was already moving, low and fast, using the rocks the way someone uses them when they've grown up in this country and know exactly how to disappear into the terrain. Mara stayed behind the boulder because she'd said she would, and she counted her heartbeats and listened. Voices, then the sound of bodies in contact, the grunt of impact, the scrape of boots on rock. She held still as long as she could. Then she heard something that changed her mind about staying put, a particular kind of silence that had a wrongness to it. She moved. She came around the far side of the rocks and found them near the edge of the riverbed. Cole had Tyler pinned against the stone, forearm across his chest, and Tyler was fighting it but not winning. His rifle was on the ground 8 feet away. His face was a bad color. Done, Cole said, his voice completely flat. It's done. You walk away right now and I won't come after you. But if you ever come back here, if you ever come near this ranch, or her again. He stopped. The silence did the rest. Tyler stopped fighting. The collapse happened in his eyes first. Something going out of them, something that had been holding the rest of him up. Then his body followed, all the tension draining away until he was just a man leaning against a rock, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, looking at the ground. Get out of here, Cole said. Take your horse, but the cattle stay. Tyler didn't look at either of them. He just pushed off the rock and walked, and they watched him until the rock swallowed him, and there was nothing left but the sound of his footsteps fading. Cole stood there, breathing. His hands were still clenched. He looked at the cattle in their rope corral, then at Mara. All right? He asked. Yes. She meant it this time. You? He unclenched his hand slowly, bent and picked up Tyler's rifle and threw it into the riverbed, where it clattered and was still. Let's get them home. They herded the 5 cattle back across the rough country, taking turns pushing and guiding, moving slowly because the animals were tired and the ground was bad, and there was no point in hurrying something that couldn't be hurried. They worked well together, she and Cole, without needing to say much. She'd noticed that about him over the past weeks, that when the work was serious, he didn't use unnecessary words, and neither did she, and somehow that made them efficient in a way she hadn't experienced with many people. By the time they got back to the ranch, the sun was going down in shades of red and orange that would have been beautiful somewhere else. Davis came out to help settle the cattle. He looked at Cole, then at Mara, then back at Cole, and his eyes went to the dried blood on Cole's knuckles and the dust on both of them, and he made his assessment and let it go. Tyler, he said. Gone, Cole said. For good this time. Davis nodded. You sure? I'm sure. That night was quieter than usual. After supper, after the kitchen was clean and Davis and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, Mara found Cole on the porch. He'd brought out a bottle of whiskey and poured a glass and was sitting with it untouched in his hand, looking at the dark horizon. She sat down beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. You think he'll actually stay gone? She asked. Yes. He said it without hesitation. He knows where that road ends. They sat with the night sounds. Somewhere far off, a coyote, the cattle shifting in the pen, the particular creak of the porch boards that she'd learned meant the temperature was dropping. I've been thinking, Mara said. About what? About Harrison. About the town. She turned her glass. She'd poured herself water, the last of what they had until morning, in her hands. He's not going to stop. No. And the longer this goes on, the worse it gets. For you, for Davis and Pete, for anyone still willing to do business with you. Also, yes. So we have to do something, not just endure. She looked at him. I've been trying to think of what. Cole looked back at her. In the dark, the exhaustion on his face was somehow more visible, the lines of it deeper, but his eyes were still sharp, still paying attention. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, she admitted, but I think the answer is in town. Not out here. He's built his power in town, which means that's where it can be challenged. Cole was quiet for a while, then, Harrison's been running Iron Ridge since before I was old enough to vote. People are scared of him. Some people. Not all. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, about the way the woman had looked at her, straight on, without the sidelong slide of judgment. Not all. Cole didn't answer that. But he didn't dismiss it either, which she'd learned was his version of paying a thing serious attention. He handed her the glass of whiskey without comment. She took it and drank, and the whiskey was cheap but warm, and they sat together on the porch in the dark, two people holding on to a piece of land that the world was trying to take from them. And somewhere in that shared holding there was something that had begun to feel, very quietly and without either of them naming it yet, like partnership. The heat broke on the 14th day of the third week. Mara heard it before she saw it, woke in the deep dark to a sound she'd forgotten existed. Thunder, low and rolling, coming from somewhere that had moisture in it, somewhere that meant it. She went to the window and pressed her face to the glass and looked up, and the sky had gone from its endless flat black to something churning and dark and full. And then the rain began. She didn't stay at the window. She went outside, barefoot and in her nightgown, not caring, standing in the yard with her face turned up and the first drops hitting her skin and running down her neck and soaking through her clothes. And she stood there and let it happen and didn't try to be dignified about any of it. The men poured out of the bunkhouse hollering. Davis threw his hat in the air. Pete danced in an ungainly circle with his arms spread wide. Mara laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes from somewhere below the ribcage and isn't controlled. Cole came out of the barn and he stopped a few feet from her, and he looked up at the rain coming down. And then he looked at her. And he smiled. Not the small, tight version she'd gotten used to, not the ghost of a smile that came and went before you were sure you'd seen it. A real one. Big enough to change the whole shape of his face, to take years off it, to show the person underneath the one who'd been carrying so much for so long. Mara looked at that smile and felt something move through her chest, like the thunder was moving through the ground. She smiled back, and the rain kept falling, and it rained through the night and into the morning, and when it finally stopped, the land smelled like the beginning of something. The rain changed things. Not all at once, not completely, but in the way that water changes dry ground, slowly at first, then everywhere. The creek came back. Not the full version of itself, not yet, but enough. Enough that Mara didn't have to make the dark morning walks to the seep anymore. Enough that the cattle could drink without being rationed. Enough that the land stopped looking like something that had already given up. The grass that came up in the week after the rain was thin and pale, but it was there. And the cattle found it and put their heads down and ate with a focused desperation that was almost painful to watch. Cole walked the pastures every morning, checking the herd, counting, assessing. He didn't say much about what he found, but the specific set of his shoulders started to change. Not relaxed. Cole Mercer was not a man who relaxed, but less braced. Less like he was standing in a doorway waiting for the next thing to hit him. The men who'd left didn't come back. Mara hadn't expected them to. But some of the hostility that had been in the air around the ranch seemed to have gone with the heat, as if the drought itself had been the source of it, and not her at all. Davis started talking to her at meals, not just responding, but actually talking. Pete brought her a handful of wild herbs he'd found near the creek without being asked, holding them out with the awkward gravity of a young man doing something he'd decided was right, but wasn't sure how to do. "Thought you might want these," he said. "I do." "Thank you, Pete." He nodded and walked away quickly, and Mara stood in the kitchen doorway holding a fistful of herbs and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than that. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who didn't have to bother. But the town was still there. Harrison was still there. Cole came back from a supply run one afternoon with less than he'd asked for and a tightness around his mouth that Mara had learned to read. She waited until after supper, until Davis and Pete had gone out, and then she sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "Tell me," she said. Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Henderson at the store says he'll sell to me, but quietly. Side door, cash only, no credit. Says if Harrison finds out he's been selling to the ranch, he'll pull his business from the whole block." He set the cup down. "Which means half the merchants on that street would follow. So Henderson's helping us, but he's scared. Everyone's scared of Harrison. He's been holding that town's money for 30 years. Cole looked at her. "He came to see me this morning. Harrison. Came out here himself. Mara went still. What did he say? That the town council had concerns about the moral character of this operation. Cole's voice was flat, doing the work of keeping what was underneath it from getting out. Said a woman living on the property without proper arrangement was a problem for the community. Said if I didn't address it, the council would address it for me. The word moral landed in Mara's stomach like a stone dropped in water. She felt the ripples of it go outward. He's using me. He's using every tool he has. That's what he does. Cole met her eyes. He also said the bank would be reviewing our loan terms. Can he do that? He's on the board of the bank. Cole said it without inflection. So yes. Mara stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the yard, the barn, the pasture beyond where the cattle were moving slow and steady in the evening light. She thought about how long it had taken to get here. Not just the weeks at this ranch, but the years before. All the places she'd been told to leave, all the roads she'd walked, all the versions of this same conversation where someone with more power than her had decided she was the problem. She was so tired of being the problem. I'm going to town, she said. Mara, not to cause trouble. She turned around. To talk to people. To find out who Harrison actually has and who he just thinks he has. She looked at Cole steadily. You said not everyone in town was against us. I think you're right. But sitting out here waiting for Harrison to make his next move isn't working. Cole was quiet for a long time. She could see him going through the arguments against it, the risk, the humiliation she might face, the possibility that it would make things worse. She could also see the moment he decided she was right about that last part being less of a concern than he'd thought. All right, he said. She went the next morning. The main street of Iron Ridge had the kind of quiet that a small town gets when word has traveled ahead of you. Not empty. People were there, going about their business. But the quality of it changed when she walked onto the boardwalk. Conversation slowed, eyes moved toward her and then deliberately away. Mara kept walking. She went to the general store first. The owner saw her coming through the window and was already shaking his head by the time she pushed the door open. I told your man we can't. I know what you told Davis. Mara walked to the counter. She didn't raise her voice. I want to talk to you directly. You've been selling to the Mercer Ranch for years. You know Cole Mercer. You know what kind of man he is. The store owner, his name was Garrett, she'd found that out, looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows he's doing something wrong and has decided to do it anyway. I don't have anything against Cole personally. But Harrison told you to cut us off. He didn't tell me. He made it clear that you'd lose business if you didn't. Mara looked at him. How much of your business comes from Harrison directly, not from people who are afraid of him, from him? Garrett's mouth tightened. He didn't answer, which was an answer. Because if it's less than you think, Mara said, then maybe the math is different than he wants you to believe. She left before he could respond, because she hadn't come to win that argument today. She'd come to plant something. The next stop was the woman she'd seen on her first walk through town. The one who'd watched her from a doorway with an expression that wasn't hostile exactly, more like someone putting pieces together. Her name was Sarah Elliott, and she ran the town's small dry goods operation, 2 doors down from the saloon. Sarah looked up when Mara came in. She didn't look away. Miss Vance, she said, you know my name. Everyone knows your name. Sarah set down the fabric she'd been folding. What can I do for you? I'm not sure yet. Mara looked around the small shop. It was clean and well organized, the shelves full in a way that said the owner knew what she was doing. I heard your husband worked the fields through the drought, lost a good portion of what he planted. Sarah's expression shifted slightly. We managed. Cole's men helped sandbag the creek bed on the south side of your property. 3 weeks ago, when the water was dropping and there was a chance it would take your irrigation ditch with it. Did you know that? A pause. I knew someone had done it. I didn't know who. Davis and Pete, on Cole's orders. Mara met her eyes. He didn't tell you because he wasn't asking for anything back. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, Harrison came by last week. I know. He said some things about you, about the situation out at the Mercer Ranch. I know what he said. Are they true? No. Mara said it without decoration. I work for Cole Mercer. I cook for his crew. That is the whole of it. Harrison wants the land, and I'm a convenient reason to squeeze Cole until he can't hold on. She paused. You don't have to believe me. You can ask Davis, who's been on that ranch for 20 years and has no reason to lie for either of us. Sarah looked at her for a long time with the considering expression of a woman who'd learned to take her time with decisions. What do you want from me? Nothing today, Mara said. I just wanted you to know what was actually happening. She was almost at the door when Sarah spoke again. My sister's girl was sick last spring, fever that wouldn't break. You sent something out. Willow bark mixed with something else. Dr. Pelham said it wouldn't help. A beet. She's fine now. Mara stopped. She barely remembered that. Someone had mentioned a sick child at the ranch. She'd put together what she had and sent it out with Davis on a supply run. A small thing. I'm glad she's better. So am I. Sarah's voice was quiet. I haven't forgotten that. Mara walked out into the afternoon sun. Her heart was beating faster than the occasion seemed to warrant, but she understood why. She was doing something. Not enduring, not waiting, not making herself small in hopes that the problem would pass over her. Something. Harrison found her before she reached the end of the block. He must have been watching from somewhere. From the bank, maybe, which sat at the corner with its solid brick face and its air of permanent authority. He came down the steps with two men behind him, and his expression had none of the performance of concern he'd shown at the ranch. This was just cold. Miss Vance? He stopped 6 feet from her. The two men spread slightly behind him, not threatening exactly, just present. You're a long way from the Mercer place. Iron Ridge is a public town. It is, and the public has standards. He looked at her the way men like him look at things they've already decided about. I think you'd do well to remember that. I think you'd do well to remember that threatening a woman on a public street is the kind of thing people notice, Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. And remember. Harrison's eyes narrowed, just slightly. You've got a bold tongue for someone in your position. What position is that? Vulnerable, he said. One word, delivered quietly, which made it land harder than shouting would have. Mara felt it, felt the weight of what he was telling her, that he could make her life very difficult, that he had the power and the will and the patience to do it, that she was a woman alone with no money and no family and no standing in this community, and all of that was true. All of it was true. And she was still standing here. I've been vulnerable my whole life, she said. It hasn't killed me yet. She walked past him. He didn't stop her. Her hands were shaking by the time she rounded the corner, and she pressed them against her skirt and kept walking and didn't look back. Cole was on the porch when she got back to the ranch. He stood when he saw her coming up the road, and she could tell by the set of him that he'd been waiting and not entirely calmly. What happened? He said. I talked to some people. She climbed the porch steps. I ran into Harrison. I figured he'd hear you were in town. Cole's jaw was doing the thing. Did he threaten you? He tried. Mara. I'm all right. She sat down on the porch step. She was tired, the particular tired that comes from holding yourself together in public for a long time. Harrison told me I was vulnerable. Cole sat down beside her. What did you say? I told him it hadn't killed me yet. She looked at her hands in her lap. The shaking had stopped. I think I meant it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah Elliott sent a message out with the boy who works at the livery. Said she wanted to talk to me when I had time. Mara looked up. When did that come in? An hour ago. Cole's eyes were on her. What did you say to her? The truth. Mara looked back at the road, at the empty stretch of it running toward town. I told the truth and let her decide what to do with it. Cole didn't respond immediately. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and looked at the same road she was looking at. That was smart, he said finally. It was the only thing I had. Sometimes that's the thing that works. He glanced at her sideways. Sometimes it isn't. I know. She paused. I know it might not be enough. I know Harrison's been running this town for 30 years, and one conversation with a dry goods owner isn't going to change that. She turned to look at him. But I couldn't just sit here anymore. Cole held her gaze. Whatever he saw there, he seemed to be satisfied by it. No, he said. I don't imagine you could. They sat in the last of the evening light, and below them on the road a hawk dropped out of the sky toward something in the grass, and then rose again, empty-taloned, and kept flying, and neither of them said what they were thinking, which was that sometimes you came up empty and you kept going anyway. It was the only way anyone ever got anywhere worth going. Sarah Elliott came to the ranch 4 days after Mara's visit to town. She didn't send word ahead. She just appeared one morning in a wagon with her husband beside her, and a look on her face that said she'd made a decision and wasn't interested in revisiting it. She had a crate of dry goods in the wagon bed, flour, sugar, coffee, a tin of lard, and she set it on the porch without ceremony. I'm not doing this because I'm not scared of Harrison, she said to Cole, who'd come out of the barn when he heard the wagon. I'm doing it because I've decided being scared of him isn't a good enough reason anymore. Cole looked at the crate. Something moved in his face. I'll pay you for it. At cost, not a cent more. Sarah's husband, a quiet, solid man named Robert, who looked like he'd thought this through and arrived at the same place as his wife, helped carry the crate inside without being asked. And I talked to Garrett. What'd he say? He said he'd think about it. Sarah's mouth tightened. Which means he's afraid but not completely decided. Which means he might be movable. She looked at Mara, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. What you said about the math being different than Harrison wants us to think. I've been running numbers in my head since you left my shop. And? Mara said. Harrison does a lot of business in town, but most of it runs through people who need us as much as they need him, and they're not going to cut off their own supply lines forever just because he says so. Sarah crossed her arms. The question is whether enough people figure that out before he does enough damage that it doesn't matter. It was the most useful thing anyone outside the ranch had said to Mara since she'd arrived in Iron Ridge. She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the specific sensation of a weight being redistributed. Still heavy, just carried differently. Come inside, Mara said. I'll make coffee. That was the beginning of it. Over the next 2 weeks, the visitors came. Not all at once and not in any organized way. Just people arriving individually, mostly in the early morning or at dusk when the road was less likely to be observed. A farmer from the eastern edge of the county who'd had feed delivered to the Mercer barn during the worst of the drought by Davis, acting on Cole's quiet instruction. A woman named Clara, whose roof had been patched by Pete, and one of the other hands after a windstorm 3 months ago. The blacksmith's apprentice, who was not the blacksmith himself was still too afraid, but who came with a repaired piece of equipment that Cole had dropped off 2 weeks earlier and hadn't expected back. Each one brought something. Not always supplies, sometimes just the fact of their presence. Standing in the yard for 20 minutes, talking to Cole or Davis, letting themselves be seen there, as if proximity was its own kind of statement. Harrison noticed. Of course he noticed. A man who'd spent 30 years maintaining his position noticed when things started moving differently. He came to the ranch again on a Tuesday morning, and this time he didn't bring armed men. He came alone, which surprised Mara when she saw him ride up. She was in the garden. She'd expanded it steadily since the rain, getting it ready for fall planting. And she stayed where she was, her hands in the dirt, watching him dismount at the gate. Cole came out of the barn. Harrison looked older up close today, she thought. Or maybe it was just that some of the authority had gone out of him. Not much, but some. The kind of small deflation that happens to powerful people when they begin to sense that the ground has moved under their feet. Cole. He nodded toward the garden where Mara was working without looking at her directly. I'd like a word. Private. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Mara. Harrison's jaw tightened. He glanced at her then, one quick, flat look, and then back at Cole. I came to offer you a way out of this. Out of what? This situation you've put yourself in. Harrison turned his hat in his hands, which was the first time Mara had ever seen him do anything with his hands that looked uncertain. The bank loan is a problem. I think we both know that. And the way things are going in town, the longer this drags on, the worse your position gets. My position feels about the same as it did last week, Cole said. Then you're not paying attention. Harrison's voice sharpened. I've had 3 families approach me about the eastern pasture land. 3 buyers, Cole. Good money. Enough to pay off the bank loan, pay off your other debts, and leave you with something to start over somewhere else. The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Mara kept her hands in the dirt. She didn't look up. She was aware that everything she was, her presence here, her position, the threat she apparently represented to a certain kind of order, was sitting in the middle of this conversation like a stone in a road. You want me to sell, Cole said. I want you to be practical. Harrison's tone moved towards something that might have been genuine, which made it worse somehow. You're fighting something you can't win, son. The town is against you. Your crew has halved. You've got a woman living on your property that half the county thinks is your... Careful, Cole said. Harrison stopped, looked at him. I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to get my land. Cole's voice was even, which Mara had learned meant he was angrier than he sounded. You've been trying to get it since my father was alive. You've just found a more creative approach this time. He took a step forward. I'm not selling. Not the east pasture, not any pasture, not anything. And if you come out here again to tell me how practical it would be to give you what you want, I'm going to stop being polite about it. Harrison looked at him for a long moment. The hat turned twice more in his hands. Then he looked at Mara. A longer look this time, the kind that was making an assessment. You've got more influence over him than you know, he said to her directly. It was the first time he'd spoken to her as if she were fully present. More than is good for either of you. I don't have influence over Cole, Mara said. He makes his own decisions, always has. She met Harrison's eyes. That's what bothers you about him. Harrison held her gaze for exactly long enough to make it clear he'd heard her. Then he put his hat back on, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. Cole stood in the yard watching him go. His hands were at his sides, unclenched this time. He was breathing steadily. He's going to move on the loan, Cole said without turning around. I know. Probably within the week, he'll find whatever clause he needs and call it in. How much? 1,500, give or take. Cole finally turned to face her. The afternoon light was behind him, making it hard to read his expression. I don't have that kind of money liquid. Most of what I have is in the cattle and the land and the equipment, and selling any of it fast enough to matter means selling it wrong. Mara pulled off her garden gloves. She stood up slowly, her knees protesting. She'd been kneeling in the dirt for 2 hours. She thought about what $1,500 meant to a cattle rancher with a reduced herd after a drought. She thought about the math, the same way she'd been thinking about everything on this ranch since the first week. Stretch what you have, find what's hidden. Don't flinch at the numbers. Then we find another way, she said. Cole looked at her. Mara, $1,500. I know what it is. She tucked the gloves under her arm. Give me a few days. He didn't ask what she was planning. She wasn't entirely sure yet herself, which was probably why. The loan papers arrived from the bank 3 days later. A letter, formal and correct, citing the credit risk clause and demanding full payment within 30 days. Cole read it at the kitchen table with the same expression he'd used when he checked the empty well, a particular stillness that had resignation at the edges. Mara took the letter when he was done with it and read it herself. Twice. He's punctual, she said. He's been waiting to do this for months. He's had the paperwork ready. Cole folded his arms on the table and looked at the window. I'm going to have to sell some cattle. How many? 12, maybe 15, at current prices depressed because everyone's selling after the drought. He did the math out loud, flatly. It won't be enough. I'll come up maybe 300 short, and that's if I get decent prices, which I won't because Harrison will have talked to every buyer in the region. He would do that. He would absolutely do that. Mara set the letter down. She thought about Sarah Elliott standing on the porch with her crate of dry goods and her statement about math. She thought about the farmer from the eastern county, and Clara whose roof had been patched, and the blacksmith's apprentice who'd brought back the equipment quietly. She thought about what those people had in common. They owed something. Not money, something older than money, the kind of debt that doesn't get settled in single transactions. I need to talk to some people, she said. Mara, I can't ask. You're not asking. I am. Cole looked at her with an expression she'd come to know well, the one where he was working through the conflict between not wanting to need help and understanding that needing help wasn't the same as being weak. He'd gotten better at that conflict over the past weeks. He hadn't resolved it, but he'd gotten better at sitting with it. All right, he said. She went to see Mrs. Henderson first. The woman listened to the whole situation at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, her face moving through several expressions in sequence: concern, anger, and then the particular focused look of someone who has decided to act. How much is he short? Mrs. Henderson asked. If Cole sells what he can, probably around 300, maybe more depending on what the cattle bring. Mara paused. I'm not coming to ask you for $300. I know you're not. You're coming because I know people. Mrs. Henderson stood up. How many people helped Cole through the drought? How many people has that ranch done quiet favors for over the years? More than Harrison knows about. More than Harrison knows about. Mrs. Henderson nodded. That's the thing about men like him. They think they know everything that happens in a community because they know everything that happens in town. But community isn't town. Community is all the small things people do for each other that never get announced anywhere. She looked at Mara steadily. I'll make some visits. I don't want anyone putting themselves at risk. We're already at risk. Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm. Harrison's already shown us what he's willing to do. The question isn't whether he'll come for us eventually. The question is whether we let him pick us off one at a time or whether we stand together. She picked up her shawl from the back of the chair. Go home, Mara. Let me work. Mara went home. The next 4 days were the hardest kind of waiting. The kind where you've done what you can, and now the outcome belongs to other people, and you have no way to affect it, and you just have to keep your hands busy and your mind from spiraling. She cooked. She tended the garden. She walked the fence lines with Cole in the evenings, checking the wire that Tyler had cut and that Davis had repaired, making sure it held. Cole sold 12 cattle. He got worse prices than he'd hoped, which meant he was going to be further short than he'd calculated. He told Mara the number on a Thursday evening, quietly, sitting at the kitchen table with the bill of sale in front of him. $1,140, he said. I need $1,500. I know. That's 360 short. I know, Cole. He looked at her. What are you not telling me? I'm not telling you anything. I'm waiting to see how something comes out before I say anything about it. He held her gaze for a moment, trying to read what was behind it. Then he nodded once and didn't push, which was one of the things about him she'd come to rely on. He trusted her enough to wait. Mrs. Henderson arrived 2 days later. She came in her wagon and she had Robert with her, which was usual, but she also had 3 other wagons behind her, which was not. Mara heard them from the kitchen and went to the window, and what she saw made her stand very still for a moment. 6 families. Maybe 7. Coming up the road to the Mercer Ranch on a Saturday morning with various crates and parcels in their wagons, and the particular bearing of people who have made up their minds and are no longer worried about who's watching. Cole came out of the barn. Mrs. Henderson climbed down first. She had an envelope in her hand that she held out to Cole without preamble. $1,400, she said, from 11 families. What we could put together. Cole looked at the envelope. He didn't take it immediately. Mrs. Henderson, don't. Her voice was gentle but absolute. Don't say you can't take it. Don't say it's too much. Don't make me stand here and argue with a man who would have done the same for any one of us without thinking twice. It's not the same. It's exactly the same. She pushed the envelope toward him. The Kellerman boys helped bring in your south fence before the first bad storm 4 years ago. You helped the Miller family dig their well extension the summer before that. You sent Pete over to help clear the Andersons' road after the last mudslide, and he was there for 2 days and you never said a word about it to anyone. She looked at him steadily. We know what you've done, Cole. We kept track even if you didn't. Something shifted in Cole's face. Not the wall coming down, but it wasn't dramatic like that. More like a door opening a small amount, just enough to let something in that had been standing outside for a long time. He took the envelope. We're still 160 short. he said, his voice rougher than usual. No, you're not. That was Davis, coming around from the side of the house. He had his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who'd been rehearsing something and was now committed to saying it. He held out a folded piece of paper. Saved it over 20 years, figured I'd use it for something that mattered someday. Cole stared at him. Davis, that's my business, what it is. Davis pushed it forward. Take it, boss. Before I think about it too long. Cole took it. His jaw was working. He turned away from everyone for a moment, facing the barn, and Mara watched the line of his back and thought about all the years he'd been carrying this place alone and what it must feel like to have all these people standing in his yard because of it. He turned back around. His eyes were red at the edges, which was the most she'd ever seen him show. Thank you, he said, and his voice only broke slightly on the two words, which given everything she thought was remarkable. Don't thank us, Mr. Henderson said. Just go pay off that snake. Cole went to the bank the next morning. Mara went with him. She'd told him she was coming, and he'd looked at her for a moment and then said, all right, which was all she'd needed. Harrison was in his office. He looked up when they walked in, and something moved across his face. Surprise, quickly controlled. He hadn't expected Cole to have the money. He'd done his calculations, and they hadn't included 11 families and 20 years of a ranch hand's savings. Cole put the envelope on Harrison's desk. Full payment, counted twice. Harrison opened it, counted it himself slowly, his face a careful blank. He was looking for it to be short. It wasn't. He looked up. His eyes moved to Mara, then back to Cole. Where did you get this? Friends, Cole said. Turns out I have more of them than you thought. Harrison held the gaze for a long moment. Then he pulled out the loan documents and stamped them paid in full, his movements deliberate and controlled. He slid the papers across the desk. This doesn't change the town council's position, he said. The town council's position is changing whether you want it to or not. Cole took the papers. Sarah Elliott told half the merchants on Main Street what you threatened her with. Mr. Garrett told the other half after that. He folded the papers and put them in his jacket. People are talking, Harrison, just not about what you want them to be talking about. Harrison's expression didn't move, but something behind it did. They walked out into the morning sun, Cole and Mara, and he held the door for her and she went through and they stood on the bank steps for a moment while their eyes adjusted. He's not done, Mara said. No. Cole squinted into the light. But he's different than he was. How do you mean? Before, he was sure he was going to win. Now he's not sure anymore. Cole looked down at her. There's a difference, small, but real. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they had a different quality than before. The siege feeling lifted, slowly, like fog burning off in the morning. It didn't disappear. Harrison still had influence. The town council still publicly disapproved. There were still merchants who wouldn't sell to them directly. But the edges of it had softened. The wall had developed too many gaps to hold. Sarah Elliott started selling to them openly. Garrett followed a week later, still nervous, still watching the street when they came in, but there. The blacksmith agreed to shoe their horses again. Small things, the accumulated weight of small things. One evening in early October, Mara was in the kitchen after supper. Cole had stayed at the table after Davis and Pete left, which he'd been doing more often lately. She was washing dishes and he was sitting with his coffee, not reading or doing anything, just sitting. I've been thinking, he said. Mara kept washing. About what? About what comes next, for the ranch. A pause. For us. She set down the plate she was holding, turned around. He was looking at her directly, the way he looked at things he was serious about. The herd's recovering, he said. Slowly, but it is. And with the garden you've put in, we're going to have more stored for winter than we've had in years. He turned the coffee cup once. I've been thinking about hiring on a couple of men again, come spring, getting back to what we should be. That's good, Mara said. It's good because of you. He said it plainly, without sentimentality. You kept this place alive when it was dying. You kept the men fed. You found water. You went to town when I didn't know how to ask the right people for help. He looked at her. I don't know if I've said that plainly enough. You've said it. I want to say it again. He stood up. He wasn't a man who moved without purpose, and he came toward her now with the same quality, deliberate, considered, like he'd been thinking about this and had decided. He stopped close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. I want you to stay. Not as the cook. Not as... He stopped, looking for the word. Not as something with a job title. I want you here because this place is yours as much as it's mine, because you've earned that. Mara felt her chest do something complicated. Cole. I'm not good at this, he said. I know that. I've been alone long enough that I don't know how to say some things without them coming out wrong. He paused. But I know what I want. I want to wake up every morning and have you here. I want to sit on this porch in the evening and have you next to me. I want... He stopped again. What? Mara said quietly. Everything. He said it simply. No decoration, no softening. I want everything. If you want that too. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the cattle moving in the pen, and somewhere further off the sound of Pete's voice carrying across the dark, saying something to Davis, and the ordinary night sounds of a ranch at the end of a long day. She looked at Cole, at the serious gray eyes and the lines around them, and the jaw that was always set a little too tight, and the hands that were scarred from years of work. At the man who'd told her to go away and then ridden to town before dawn to find her, who'd stood between her and Tyler without being asked, who'd held her hand while they sat in the yard and watched their neighbors ride away after paying off a debt he'd never asked them for. Yes, she said. The word came out before she'd finished deciding to say it, which told her everything she needed to know about whether the decision had already been made. Cole looked at her for a moment like he was checking that he'd heard right. Then something in his face opened. Not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just the particular easing of a person who's been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, and his hand stayed there, warm against her cheek. She put her hand over his. You sure? He said. I'm sure. He kissed her. Carefully at first, the way you do something you've been thinking about long enough that you want to get it right. Then less carefully. Then not carefully at all. When they pulled apart, she was breathing differently than usual, and so was he. And there was something in his eyes that she'd never seen there before. Not the controlled attention she'd gotten used to, but something looser, happier. I should, he started. Stay, she said. He stayed. They sat on the porch for a long time after that, close together, not talking much. The stars were out in full, the sky clear and cold in the way of October nights, and the land around them was quiet in the way it got when nothing was immediately wrong. Not peaceful exactly. This land didn't do peaceful. It did alive or it did dead, and tonight it was alive, but still, present. Harrison's going to try something else, Cole said. Probably. Are you worried? Mara thought about it honestly. Yes, but not in the same way I was. She looked out at the dark. Before, I was scared because I didn't know if I had a place here, if I was staying or going, if any of this was real. She paused. Now I know. Cole turned to look at her. And knowing makes it different. She met his eyes. It's still hard. It's still going to be hard. But hard with a place to stand is different from hard without one. Cole held her gaze. Then he nodded, once, slowly, like that answer had settled something. We've got a place to stand, he said. Yeah, Mara said. We do. Below them, the ranch sat in the dark. The barn, and the house, and the garden, and the pen full of cattle that were thin but alive and getting stronger. The fences that had been cut and repaired. The kitchen where she'd made stew from nothing and carried it across a yard to a man who'd told her to go away. The porch where they were sitting now, shoulders touching, looking at a sky full of cold October stars. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't finished. There were things still wrong with it and things still coming at them, and a man in town who hadn't given up and wouldn't give up easily. But it was theirs. That was the thing Mara had spent 15 years not understanding. That belonging wasn't a thing someone gave you. It was a thing you built, with your hands and your stubbornness and your willingness to stay even when leaving would have been easier. It was a thing you earned through the work, the daily particular work of showing up and doing what needed doing and refusing to disappear even when the world suggested, repeatedly and with conviction, that disappearing would be more convenient for everyone. She'd built this, not alone. You never built anything real alone. But she'd been here for the building of it, and her hands were in every part of it, and nobody could take that. Harrison could try. He probably would try. And they would handle that when it came, the same way they'd handled everything else that had come at them. Imperfectly, expensively, together. Cole put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and they sat there while the night got colder and neither of them moved to go inside. Harrison made his next move on a Thursday morning in November, and it was quieter than anything that had come before, which made it more dangerous. No riders, no confrontation at the gate, just a letter delivered by the county sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked uncomfortable about his errand and left quickly after handing it over. Cole read it at the kitchen table while Mara poured coffee, and she watched his face go through several things in fast succession before settling into a stillness she recognized. "What is it?" she said. "He's filed a complaint with the county land office." Cole set the letter down. "Claims there are irregularities in the original deed to the north pasture. Says my father acquired it improperly in 1871, and he has documentation to support it." He looked up. "He's asking the county to review the title." Mara sat down. "Can he do that?" "He can file the complaint. Whether it goes anywhere depends on what he actually has." Cole picked the letter up again and read it a second time, slower. "If the title gets tied up in a review, I can't sell that pasture if I need to. Can't use it as collateral. And if he has something real—" He stopped. "Does he?" "I don't know." Cole set the letter down again. "My father never talked about how he got that land. He just had it. There was a deed, properly filed. I've always assumed that was the end of it." He pressed his fingers against the table. "But Harrison's been in this county a long time. He knows where to look for things." Mara looked at the letter. She thought about the way Harrison operated. Carefully, patiently, building his case piece by piece over years. He hadn't come at them with the loan until he was ready. He wouldn't have come at them with this unless he thought he had something real, or something that could be made to look real, which in the hands of the right lawyer amounted to the same thing. "Who handles land disputes in this county?" she asked. "There's a land office in Mill Haven, county seat, about 30 miles east." Cole rubbed his face with both hands. "There's also a lawyer there, Randall Sykes. He handled my father's estate. If anyone knows the history of that deed, it's him." "Then we go see him." Cole lowered his hands. "It's 30 miles, Mara." "I know how far it is." He looked at her with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to argue. He decided against it, which had become more common over the past weeks. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." They made the drive in Cole's wagon, leaving before dawn to avoid the worst of the travel heat that still lingered into November afternoons. Davis stayed to manage the ranch. Pete waved them off from the barn door with the slightly worried expression of a young man who'd been left in charge of something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The road to Mill Haven was better than the roads around Iron Ridge, which was not saying much. They rode mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that had developed between them over months of working alongside each other. Occasionally, Cole pointed out something about the land they were passing through, a change in the soil color, a creek crossing that flooded in heavy rain, a line of hills that marked the county boundary. He knew this country the way people know things they've grown up inside of, so thoroughly that they sometimes forget others don't. Mara listened. She stored it away, the way she stored everything. Randall Sykes had an office above the dry goods store in Mill Haven, accessed by an exterior staircase that creaked at every step. He was older than Mara had expected, past 70 probably, with white hair and a careful, unhurried manner. He'd known Cole's father. That was apparent from the way he stood when Cole came in, something that was almost respect. Cole explained the situation. Sykes listened without interrupting, his hands folded on his desk, his eyes moving between them. When Cole finished, Sykes was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to his filing cabinet, an enormous thing that took up most of one wall, and began pulling folders with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. Your father bought that north pasture in 1871, Sykes said, not looking up from the cabinet, from a man named Ellery Croft. Croft had homesteaded it in 1868 and proved up on it, which gave him clear title. Your father paid him $420, which was fair market value at the time. He pulled a folder and brought it to the desk. I handled the transfer myself. Harrison's claiming the acquisition was improper, Cole said. I know what Harrison's claiming. Sykes opened the folder. He filed the same complaint, in a slightly different form, in 1887 against your father. It went nowhere then, because the documentation was clear. He spread several papers on the desk. The question is whether he's found something new or whether he's hoping the original records are harder to locate now than they were then. Mara leaned forward to look at the papers. The deed was there, handwritten in the formal script of the era, with signatures and a notary stamp, clear and complete. Beside it was a transfer document and a receipt of payment. These are the originals? She asked. Copies. The originals are filed with the county. Sykes looked at her. But I also have something Harrison may not know about. He reached back into the folder and produced another document, older than the rest, its edges soft with age. Ellery Croft wrote a letter in 1873, 2 years after the sale, confirming that the transaction had been voluntary and at fair value. He was settling his affairs before moving his family to Oregon. Sykes set it on top of the pile. He'd heard rumors that someone was questioning the legitimacy of the sale. He wanted it on record. Cole stared at the letter. Someone was questioning it in 1873? Harrison's father, Sykes said simply. He wanted that land too. Same family, same approach, different generation. He looked at Cole over his glasses. This is not a new fight, son. You're just the one having it now. Mara felt something settle in her. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of clarification, the shape of what they were dealing with becoming visible in its full dimensions. Harrison wasn't reacting to her, wasn't reacting to Cole's choices, wasn't even reacting to the last several months. He was continuing something that had started before any of them were born. The land was what he'd always wanted. Everything else, the moral complaints, the social pressure, the loan, the title challenge, these were all instruments. Tools in a very old hand. What do we do with this? Cole said. You file a response with the county land office. I'll prepare it. Sykes began gathering the papers back into the folder with the deliberate movements of a man who has seen many things and has learned not to waste energy on alarm. Include certified copies of the deed, the transfer, the payment receipt, and Croft's letter. Harrison's complaint will be reviewed and dismissed. It may take a few months, but the documentation is unambiguous. He looked at Cole. What he's counting on is that you don't have the resources to fight it properly, that you'll tire of the process and settle for something easier. I won't, Cole said. I know you won't. Sykes allowed himself a small, dry smile. You're exactly like your father. He wouldn't either. They filed the response that afternoon before leaving Millhaven. Sykes walked them through it, making sure every document was in order, every signature in the right place. It cost money they didn't have in excess, but it cost less than losing the north pasture. And the math on that was simple. Driving back in the early evening, with the sun going down behind them and the road stretching out ahead into the dark, Cole said, It's going to be months before this resolves. I know. Harrison will find other ways to make things difficult in the meantime. Probably. You're not worried. Mara thought about that. The honest answer was that she was. In the baseline way, she was always worried about things that could go wrong, because she'd learned young that things going wrong was the default condition, and optimism was a choice you made in spite of evidence, not because of it. But underneath the worry was something steadier. I'm not worried in the way I used to be, she said. Before I was scared of losing something I wasn't sure was mine to keep. She looked at the road ahead. Now I know it's mine, ours, and that changes how the fear sits. Cole reached across and took her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The county land office issued its ruling in February. It arrived in a letter, official and brief, stating that the title to the north pasture was clear and the complaint had been found to have no merit. Cole read it standing at the kitchen table, then set it down and stood there a moment. Then he picked it up and took it outside and walked to the barn, and Mara didn't follow him, because she understood he needed a minute that was just his. When he came back, he looked like a man who'd put down something heavy enough that he wasn't entirely sure how to carry himself without the weight of it. "It's done," he said. "Yes." He sat down. He looked at the table, then at her. "I've been fighting that man my whole adult life without knowing I was fighting him. Just thought things were hard, thought the land was hard, the weather was hard, the business was hard." He paused. "Some of it was just Harrison." "Some of it was just hard," Mara said. "Both things can be true." Cole looked at her. Then he nodded, slowly, like that was something worth holding on to. Harrison didn't fight the ruling. Mara had half expected him to. Another filing, another delay, something. But he didn't. Whether it was the completeness of the documentation, or the public shift in community opinion, or simply the calculation that he'd spent enough on a fight he wasn't going to win, he let it go. He was still in Iron Ridge, still at the bank, still a powerful man. But the particular focus he'd turned on the Mercer Ranch had moved elsewhere, and in its absence the air was lighter in a way that took some getting used to. The town council election happened in March. Mr. Henderson ran. So did Sarah Elliott, which surprised people and probably shouldn't have. Harrison ran for his own seat and won it, because 30 years of influence doesn't evaporate in one season. But he no longer held the majority. The council that convened in the spring was different enough that the policies Harrison had used against Cole, the quiet pressure on merchants, the coordinated refusals, couldn't be sustained without open opposition. The blacksmith started doing business with them again without apology. Garrett at the general store extended credit. Small things. The accumulated weight of small things, which Mara had come to understand, was the only way large things ever actually changed. Spring came to the ranch with the insistence that springs have in hard country. Not gentle, just persistent. The garden came up. Mara had planted it in the fall with winter varieties and replanted in March with everything she could fit in the expanded beds Cole had helped her build in October, working evenings after the other work was done. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs, more than they could eat. "You're going to have too much," Cole said, looking at it one morning. "That's the point," Mara said. "Too much means we can give some away. Too much means we have enough." He looked at her sideways. "Is that philosophy or gardening?" "Both." He hired 2 new hands in April. Young men, brothers, who'd heard about the ranch from the Henderson family and came with their own equipment and reasonable expectations. They ate Mara's food and called her ma'am and stayed out of her kitchen except at meals, which was all she'd ever asked. The herd rebuilt slowly, the way herds do after a drought. Not in a season, not in a year, but incrementally, calf by calf, the numbers climbing back towards something that made sense. Cole worked the cattle with the focused patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried and had stopped wanting to hurry them. Davis's knee got worse in the cold months and better in the warm ones, and he worked around it with the pragmatic adaptation of someone who'd decided he wasn't going anywhere. They married on a cold Saturday in December, in the same church where half the town had once looked at Mara like she was a problem to be resolved. The same people who'd stood in the street and listened to Tyler's version of events were there. Some of them looking at their shoes, some of them looking at her directly, with the specific expression of people who've revised their opinion and aren't quite sure what to do with the revision. Mara didn't hold it against any of them. She understood how fear worked. She understood how easier it was to believe the worst about someone you didn't know. What she wouldn't do was pretend the months of it hadn't happened. She didn't have to be cruel about that. She just had to be honest. Mrs. Henderson cried. Cole's vows were short and specific, and made in the same quiet voice he used for everything that mattered to him. Mara shook slightly on the second sentence and steadied after that. Davis brought flowers he'd cut himself from somewhere on the property, held in one big hand with the self-consciousness of a man unused to carrying flowers, and presented them to her before the ceremony without explanation. "Thank you, Davis," she said. "Don't make it strange," he said, and walked away. She laughed. It was real laughter, the unself-conscious kind, and it was still in her face when she walked down the aisle, which was probably not the most conventional way to begin a wedding ceremony, but it was honest, and honesty had always served her better than convention. Standing in her kitchen 10 years later, their kitchen, though she still sometimes thought of it that way first and caught herself, Mara would sometimes try to identify the moment things had turned, the single point at which the trajectory changed. She could never find it. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving hard times. It didn't happen in a moment. It happened in the accumulation of small refusals. Every morning she'd gotten up. Every meal she'd made when she had almost nothing to make it with. Every time she'd stayed when leaving would have been simpler. Every time she'd chosen to believe that this place was worth fighting for, even when the fighting was exhausting and the outcome uncertain. She hadn't saved the ranch. Not alone, not in one dramatic gesture. She just kept showing up day after day, and that turned out to be enough. People talked about her story in the county for years. They got details wrong, the way people always do, inflating certain moments and omitting others, making it neater in the telling than it had ever been in the living. The woman who saved the Mercer Ranch during the worst drought in 20 years. That was the version that circulated. But the version Mara knew was messier and smaller and more real. A woman who'd been walking for 15 years and walked into one more difficult place and decided, almost accidentally, that this was the one she was done walking away from. A man stubborn enough to hire someone he'd refused twice, smart enough to see what she was doing and let her do it, and brave enough, eventually, to say what he felt out loud. A community that chose, slowly and imperfectly, and not without cost, to be something better than what one man's money wanted to make it. There was no lesson she could have told you cleanly at the end. Life didn't work that way in her experience. But if she had to put words to what those years had taught her, sitting on the porch in the evenings with Cole's shoulder against hers, and the sound of the ranch around them, and the knowledge that she would be here tomorrow, and the day after that, it was something like this. Worth isn't given. It's built. It's maintained. It's defended when necessary with everything you have, because there will always be people who decide that your existence is an inconvenience, that your needs don't matter, that you should make yourself smaller to accommodate their comfort. And the only answer to that, the only one that ever actually worked, was to refuse. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just to keep standing in the space you'd claimed, doing the work, being present, outlasting everyone who wanted you gone. The morning the last letter came from the county land office, confirming that Harrison's final attempt to contest the property boundary had been dismissed, Cole read it at the kitchen table while Mara stood at the stove. He folded it once, twice, and set it down. "That's the last of it," he said. Mara turned around. She looked at him, at the gray in his hair now, at the deeper lines around his eyes, at the face she'd been looking at for 10 years and still hadn't finished learning. "Is it?" she said. He almost smiled. "Probably not. There'll be something else eventually. There always is." "Yeah." He looked at her across the kitchen, across the space she'd walked into with nothing and built into a life. "You worried?" Mara turned back to the stove. Outside the window, she could see the garden, and beyond it the pasture, and beyond that the hills that had looked like they were melting the first summer and were green now with the persistence of things that survived hard weather. "No," she said. And she meant it completely, with all the complicated history of what it had taken to get to the place where she could mean it. "Good," Cole said. He picked up his coffee and went back to reading, and Mara cooked, and the morning went on the way mornings did on a working ranch, full of small, necessary tasks, unremarkable, completely ordinary, which was everything she'd ever wanted in the end, not triumph, not vindication, just this. An ordinary morning that was hers, in a place that was hers, with a life she'd built with her own hands out of difficulty and stubbornness and the refusal to believe that she deserved anything less. That had been enough. That had always been enough.